All right, so we're diving deep today into the recent Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
Okay.
It's something that I think a lot of our listeners have been following.
Yeah.
You want to understand kind of what this agreement actually means, looking forward into the future.
Right.
And we've got this really great interview with Professor Egdūnas Račius.
Okay.
He's from Vytautas Magnus University.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on this Lithuanian news site, Bernardinai.lt.
All right.
And he brings up some really interesting stuff in this interview.
Yeah.
Like whether this is, a real step towards peace or just like a temporary pause.
Yeah. Is it genuine?
And then also, what about the role of players like Qatar and the US?
Oh, interesting.
How do they fit into all this?
Right. Yeah.
So I think a good place to start is with this idea that Professor Račius really emphasizes,
Okay.
which is just how fragile this agreement is.
Yeah. He stresses that right from the beginning.
Yeah. And it's not just, a simple prisoner swap. It's this whole web of interconnected details. And if one little thing gets pulled, the whole thing could fall apart.
Totally. And he really drives home that point that finding a long-term solution is going to be incredibly difficult.
Right.
And we're not just talking about a prisoner swap here.
Yeah.
There's issues like Palestinian statehood, which have been sticking points for so long.
Right. For decades.
Exactly. It's not something that a ceasefire can just magically fix.
Oh, boy.
And to really get this ceasefire, you have to look at the context of the fighting that led up to it.
Right.
Professor Račius points out that it was very one-sided, with Israel, carrying out these extensive military operations.
Mm-hmm.
He even quotes Hamas residents who are like, wait, we haven't been under fire for days?
Oh, wow.
It's really highlighting that immediate impact on daily life in Gaza.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
It's like this ceasefire isn't just some, political agreement.
Yeah.
It's like an actual change for people.
Right. It's tangible.
On the ground.
Yeah.
But let's talk about that prisoner exchange, because that seems like a major hurdle.
Yes.
What's Professor Račius's take on that?
He gets into the complexities of Israel's demands,
Okay.
which are basically pretty straightforward.
Okay.
They want all known hostages returned, and that includes people who aren't even Israeli citizens.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
On the Palestinian side, there's this distinction between criminal prisoners and political prisoners.
Okay, hold on. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure.
I'm not sure I totally get the distinction.
Yeah, no, it's important.
Why is that difference important?
Well, Professor Račius suggests that Israel sometimes uses arrests as leverage for future exchanges.
Oh.
So lumping criminal prisoners in with those who are seen as political could be a way to up their bargaining power.
I see.
It shows a really deep mistrust between the two sides.
So you're saying even the act of labeling someone a political prisoner versus a criminal prisoner, that's already a point of contention.
It adds this whole other layer to the negotiations.
Oh, boy.
It's hard to find common ground when you can't even agree on what the words mean.
Right.
Right.
So we've got this super fragile agreement.
Yes.
This history of mistrust.
Uh-huh.
And this very complicated prisoner exchange.
Right.
So where do these big global players like Qatar and the US
where do they fit
into all of this?
Yeah.
Because it seems like they're taking kind of different approaches.
Yeah, Professor Račius actually points out Qatar's role as particularly surprising.
Really?
You have this small nation playing this big role in mediating between Israel and Hamas.
That's interesting.
Right.
It's not the country that I would immediately think of
right.
as being, a major player.
Yeah, and then you have the U.S., whose influence is massive, obviously.
Right, of course.
But Professor Račius argues that their support for Israel, especially the military aid,
is actually a decisive factor in the conflict.
But isn't that kind of contradictory to Qatar's approach? It seems like the U.S. is
bolstering one side while Qatar is trying to find a middle ground.
Right.
Yeah, it creates this interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
And it gets even more complex with some of the new U.S. president's policies.
Okay.
Professor Račius mentions the decision to decriminalize actions of Israeli settlers in the West Bank.
Right.
Which some argue could actually make things worse.
So you have Qatar working towards de-escalation.
Right.
And then potentially the U.S. taking steps that could lead to more conflict.
It's like they're working against each other in a way.
Right.
It makes you wonder if these different approaches can actually work together.
Yeah, it really highlights how tricky it is.
Absolutely.
to deal with a conflict with so many different people involved.
Yeah, with all these external actors.
And speaking of the U.S.
Yeah. What does Professor Račius think about President Trump's recent decision to temporarily halt that foreign aid?
That's a big move, at least it seems like it.
Yeah.
He thinks it might be more symbolic than anything else.
Really?
He argues that the existing aid commitments are probably going to continue.
Okay.
So the actual impact on the ground might not be that big.
So it's more about sending a message
than
actually changing anything.
Exactly. Professor Račius says don't read too much into these big gestures.
Okay.
It's the actual policies and actions that matter.
So we have all these different factors at play here.
Yeah, a lot going on.
This fragile ceasefire, the prisoner exchange,
Right.
these different approaches from global powers,
Yeah.
and this long history of conflict.
It's complex.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, Professor Račius' insights really highlight that we need to look beyond just the headlines and try to understand what's really driving this situation.
Okay, so that's a good overview. But there's one other aspect that Professor Račius mentions that I want to explore more.
Okay.
He talks about the European Union, but their role seems kind of smaller in this ceasefire.
Yeah, it does.
It makes me wonder, could they do things differently than the U.S.?
Interesting question.
Yeah, maybe that's something we should talk about next.
Let's do it. It's true that EU doesn't always take such a front seat role as the U.S. does. But Professor Račius' comment made me think, what could a different approach look like?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how U.S. involvement can be, well, let's just say it's complicated.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag.
What if the EU, took a more active role? Could they maybe offer a different way towards, lasting peace?
He doesn't get into specifics.
Okay.
But he does say that the EU might have some, untapped potential.
Right.
Especially since they have different relationships with both Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, that's true.
The U.S. does.
Okay, so let's, play this out. What would a more active EU role actually look like? What could they actually do that might change things?
One thing they could do is focus on, economic development in Palestine. Stronger economic ties could mean they rely less on aid.
Right.
And that could create a better foundation for, talking and negotiating.
It makes sense because right now it feels like aid, especially from the U.S., is almost like a bargaining chip.
Totally.
It creates this dependency
It does.
that could be kind of taken advantage of.
Absolutely. The EU could also use its, diplomatic relationships to encourage dialogue. It could be like a neutral party.
Right.
Helping to build trust and, find some common ground.
That's really interesting because Professor Račius did talk about how important Qatar's efforts were in mediating.
Exactly.
Maybe the EU could kind of build on that.
Yeah.
Create this bigger international group.
Right. A coalition.
That's focused on peaceful solutions.
It's definitely a possibility. And don't forget the EU has a pretty good track record.
Oh, that's true.
When it comes to, resolving conflicts.
Within its own borders.
Exactly. They've managed to create peace.
Right.
Between countries that used to be enemies.
That's a great point.
So they have the experience.
They do.
They have the diplomatic power. It makes you wonder why they haven't been more, assertive in this particular conflict.
Yeah, why haven't they done more?
Maybe it's a political thing.
Right.
Or maybe they think it's too risky
Yeah.
to get really involved.
Too volatile.
But Professor Račius does make you think, what if they did step up?
Yeah.
Could they change things?
It's a good question.
It's a good question, and it reminds us that there isn't just one way to approach this.
Right.
There are lots of perspectives.
Yeah.
Different ways to move forward.
And that's, I guess, why this is so fascinating.
It is.
And so frustrating.
Totally.
Because it's so complicated.
It is, and even with the ceasefire, Professor Račius reminds us that the underlying issues haven't gone away. This isn't like a happy ending. It's more like a pause.
Right.
In a much longer story.
And that story is ultimately about people's lives.
Yes.
It's easy to get caught up in all the, political stuff.
Right.
But we can't forget about the human cost.
Absolutely.
Professor Račius doesn't really tell personal stories.
Yeah.
But his analysis shows how much of an impact this has.
It does.
On everyday people.
Right. We're talking about families who have lost people,
Yeah.
communities living in fear, kids who are growing up surrounded by uncertainty.
Right.
Their voices often get lost
in
all the political noise.
It's a good reminder that peace isn't just about signing papers.
Yeah.
It's about creating a world where people can be safe
Yeah.
and have dignity.
Well said.
That's really what matters here.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we keep exploring this whole situation.
Okay, so speaking of Professor Račius's analysis,
yeah,
it's one more thing he talks about that I thought was really interesting, and I think it's worth talking about a bit more.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. So we were talking about the EU and maybe them taking a more active role.
Right.
And then there's this other thing that Professor Račius says that really stood out to me.
Right.
It's about President Trump's decision to decriminalize those actions by Israeli settlers.
Oh, right.
In the West Bank.
Yeah, because on the one hand, you have this ceasefire.
Right.
It feels hopeful.
Yeah.
But then you have this other move that feels like it could make things way worse.
Yeah.
It's so contradictory.
Yeah, it's a contradiction. And Professor Račius doesn't beat around the bush.
Okay.
He says this decision is dangerous.
Wow.
It could reignite tensions and just totally ruin all the progress.
It's just when it seems like things are moving in a good direction,
right,
there's always something else.
There's always something
that could change everything.
Yeah, these decisions that can just shift the whole situation.
It's a lot to keep up with.
It is.
Especially for the people who are actually living through this.
Exactly. And that's why Professor Račius's analysis is so helpful. He's not giving us, easy answers or saying what's going to happen.
Right.
But he helps us understand how complicated it all is.
Right, all the different moving parts.
Yeah, all the different actors, the potential problems.
Yeah, the things that could go wrong.
Yeah. So where does this leave us?
That's a big question.
What's the takeaway for you?
I think the big thing is that this ceasefire is just one tiny part of a much bigger story.
Yes.
It's a break, maybe.
Yeah, a pause.
But it's not the end.
Not a solution.
The real problems, the political stuff, the economic stuff, the social stuff, that's all still there.
It hasn't gone away.
And like we were saying, there are all these powerful players involved with their own goals and their own ways of doing things.
It's a chess game.
Yeah. And one move can change the whole game.
Exactly. So we can't just sit back and relax.
Yeah, we can't get complacent.
We have to stay informed, stay involved.
Yeah.
Keep asking those tough questions.
What should the U.S. do?
Yeah, exactly.
Or the EU do more?
How can we make sure that Palestinians and Israelis...
Right, the people who are actually affected.
Yeah, how can we make sure they're heard?
And that's a lot to think about.
It is.
But it's really important.
And Professor Račius gives us a place to start. He gives us that context, the different perspectives.
We need that to understand what's really going on.
Yeah, that's simple.
So peace is fragile.
It is.
It takes work. It takes talking.
And it takes being willing to maybe change our minds about things.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Of course.
We hope this was helpful.
Yeah.
And we hope you keep learning about this.
Yeah, there's always more to learn.
There are so many perspectives out there.
So many.
And there are ways to get involved if you want to.
Absolutely.
We'll be back soon with another topic.
Sounds good.
And a new way of looking at the world.
I'm looking forward to it.
Until then, keep learning. Keep asking questions.
And keep talking about these things.
We'll see you next time.